Hello Year 13, welcome to your next lesson. Based on feedback that I received from some of you saying that I sounded a little bit sad on one of my previous videos, I've decided to make this one extra enthusiastic and happy, so prepare yourself. This is your next lesson, Holism and Reductionism Evaluation. As a starter, I want you to have a go at a little 3-mark question, which is explain what is meant by levels of explanation in relation to reductionist explanations. This is something that we covered last lesson, so try and complete it from memory because it will be more effective for your recall. If you absolutely have to, you may check your notes or your textbook, but try and do it from memory. And then, as a stretch question, I want you to pick a behaviour and provide a high, middle and low level explanation for that behaviour. So you might pick your favourite topic, which might be attachment or social. If I were you, I would do memory because I just think it fits really nicely with the levels of explanation, and it's one that we looked at last lesson. Remember to pause me and have a go yourself before listening to this next bit, which is going to give you the answer, because I will know if you haven't had a go at it yourself. So, levels of explanation. The reductionist approach suggests that explanations begin at the highest level and progressively look at component elements. So at the highest level, we have cultural and social explanations, and this is how our society and our culture affects our behaviour. Within the middle level, we have psychological explanations of behaviour, and then at the lowest level, we have biological explanations. So how do hormones, genes, neurotransmitters, all that lovely stuff affect our behaviour? And for 3 marks for that question, you would have to mention each of these levels and say what goes into each. Okay, so then what behaviour can we explain using these levels of explanation? And you can basically explain any behaviour. The example I'm going to give you is based on memory. So within memory, we can explain it at the highest level based on cultural and social influences. For example, Bartlett's study, which I spoke about last lesson, the War of the Ghosts, where Bartlett gave participants a story and then after a little while he made participants recall the story. Basically, participants' schema really affected what they recalled. So for example, there was this bit about a supernatural entity, and if a participant didn't have a pre-existing schema for ghosts, maybe they didn't believe in ghosts or all that supernatural phenomena, then they would completely omit that information and not recall it. Not because they actively or they explicitly wanted to not recall it. It just didn't fit with their schema, so they didn't remember it. Within the middle level, we have psychological explanations, and you can talk about psychological explanations of memory in terms of different types of long-term memory, perhaps episodic, semantic and procedural, or you might have spoken about how short-term memory is broken up into duration, coding and capacity, of course. And you might have spoken specifically about a piece of research there. And then at the lowest level, we can explain it with Maguire's study. So Maguire found a correlation between how long someone had been a taxi driver for in London and the density of grey matter in their hippocampus. So basically their hippocampus had increased with use the longer they had been a taxi driver. So just as a quick reminder before we go on to our evaluation, within reductionism, we looked at the levels of explanation, which we've just gone through, biological, environmental and experimental reductionism. And then within holism, we looked at Gestalt psychology, humanistic and cognitive. If you don't remember maybe one of them or all of them, just quickly flick back through your notes because you'll need to know them in order to complete this next evaluation. Okay, evaluation 1, the danger of low levels of explanation. Basically, what it's trying to say is that if we only look at lower levels explanation, so these could be biological, behavioural, psychological explanations, if we only look at these in isolation, then we overlook the whole meaning of behaviour, and it can lead to fundamental errors in understanding. So when we spoke about this last lesson, I showed you the clock. If we're only looking at the component parts of a clock in isolation, then we don't understand what a clock is useful. So Walt did some research, and he was the one that developed systematic desensitization. And he tried to treat a woman with a fear of insects with systematic desensitization, and it did not decrease her phobia at all. It did not go away. And then, after more investigation, it turned out that her husband, who she had been having marriage troubles with, had a nickname that was an insect's name. So actually, her fear conditioning was based on her marital problems rather than conditioning. She hadn't learnt this as a response. She had learnt it due to her marital problems. So overlooking certain factors of a person's life means that they cannot be treated. Another example is when people have ADHD, they're given this amphetamine called Ritalin. And this completely ignores any other reasons why this child might have ADHD. They might have family or emotional problems. They might have learned to behave in that way through looking at role models. There's lots of other explanations that could explain ADHD. Whereas if you're taking a biological approach to this, you tend to just say, okay, just treat it with drugs then. Let's not look at anything else. Drugs will treat it. When actually it might not. So how would we write an explanation for this? I want you to just pause me now and have a think about it. We need to consider all levels of human behaviour in order to fully understand a condition or a behaviour. Just looking at low levels of explanation, such as biological or behavioural, will lead to overlooking fundamental things about a person's behaviour. Next evaluation issue is on biological reductionism. So this is a strength because the fact that we're able to reduce behaviour to the lowest level, biology, means that we've been able to develop drug therapies. And such treatments have led to low rates of institutionalisation since the 1950s. Can you think of an example of maybe a behaviour or a disorder that no longer leads to institutionalisation? The example that we always use for everything else, schizophrenia. In the past, remember one of the very early schizophrenia lessons that we looked at showed the horrendous and inhumane treatments that doctors used to prescribe to schizophrenic patients a long time ago. And now this is no longer seen, and people do tend to just be put on a drug program. So less people go into mental hospitals and instead are treated with drugs. They are a more humane approach of treating illness and do not blame the patient, meaning greater tolerance for mental illness in society, because we say actually there is just something wrong with your neurotransmitters or your hormones or your genes, and this is why you're acting the way you are. It's not your fault, and therefore it's a positive for people with mental disorders. So a strength of this is that it has practical applications. So biological explanations have led to drug therapies. With environmental reductionism, you can just think about the behaviourist approach, because it's all about stimulus and response and classical conditioning. So therefore, for evaluating environmental reductionism, we can basically just evaluate the behaviourist approach. And a main drawback of the behaviourist approach is that most research is done on non-human animals, and we know that humans are much more complex than non-human animals. But even in non-human animals, we can ignore possible influences of behaviour, such as cognitive or emotional factors, which they do have, such as in attachment, for example. So what factors does environmental reductionism ignore? I want you to pause me and have a little think about that. So it ignores things such as social context, intentions, and emotions, maybe even motivation of why we're carrying out a certain behaviour. And for your evidence of this, you can just talk about Pavlov or you can talk about Skinner. The last evaluation issue for reductionism is for experimental reductionism. And what experimental reductionism reduces behaviour down to is operationalised variables. So variables that are measurable and specific. And these variables can be manipulated and measured to determine whether something has a causal relationship. So whether one thing causes the other. And while reducing behaviour to this form is very useful because it means that we can study certain things about human behaviour, it's not always representative of everyday human life. So what is an example of the lab study that was used to study eyewitness testimony, and what did they find? So I'll give you a second to think about this. So just pause me. So it was Loftus and Palmer who did the very famous eyewitness testimony, and it was lab study. So she brought participants into the lab, showed them a car crash, manipulated the verbs, and then had them estimate the speed. Anyway, the second experiment, when she came back, she asked them whether there was glass on the floor, and depending on the verb that was used, it had a massive effect on whether they said yes or no. However, Loftus and Palmer, although they found significant results, that was a very famous lab study into eyewitness testimony, it has been contradicted by studies of real life eyewitnesses, where, for example, Yule and Cutshall did a study on real eyewitnesses who had experienced a shooter in Canada, and their memory accuracy was actually 85%. And leading questions did not have the same effect on real life eyewitnesses as they did in Loftus and Palmer. Operationalising variables may result in something measurable, but that bears no resemblance to real life. So Loftus and Palmer's research was very useful, and the fact that she operationalised variables meant that she was able to find these causal relationships, but it's not accurate of real life. It was a lab study, it lacked mundane realism. And we have to consider as well that in real life, real eyewitnesses are motivated very differently in their performance. So for Loftus and Palmer, it didn't really matter what speed the participants estimated. It didn't make an impact on their life at all. Whereas with Yule and Cutshall, they were trying to find who had done this, so they had much more motivation to have an accurate memory of this. So therefore, they're not comparable, and because their findings sometimes just don't reflect reality. So therefore, experimental reductionism can be seen as less useful. And then we move on to holism evaluation. So I want you to pause me now and think of as many strengths and as many weaknesses as you can for holism. Okay, so some of the things that you could have put are: it provides a more complete picture of human behaviour. It accepts and deals with complex nature of behaviour, so it doesn't just take into account one thing, it looks at the interaction between all of this. Behaviour is influenced by many factors, so holistic explanations may be more useful in terms of creating treatments for people, with the example of the systematic desensitisation research, where the woman wasn't treated of a phobia, because we need to take into account all of the factors that might be creating these phobias. However, it is difficult to investigate the many different types and levels of explanation, and it's more hypothetical. It's not based on as much empirical evidence. If you take the humanistic approach as an example of this, there's not as much empirical evidence of self-actualization and congruence and conditions of worth than there is an approach such as the biological approach. And because of this, it lacks predictive power that more scientific explanations have. So it's hard when we take a holistic view to behaviour to predict how people will behave, because we're taking into account so many factors and the way that they interact that we can never generalise it. We can never generalise that explanation to anybody else, and therefore we can't predict behaviour. And it neglects the importance of biological influences, which in some disorders and conditions and behaviour do tend to be the most influential of factors. Okay, your last task is to have a go at these 2 questions for me, and then we'll go through them at the start of next lesson. So number 1 is to distinguish between holistic and reductionist explanations of behaviour, 4 marks, so give me 4 A01 points there, and then outline why some psychologists favour reductionist explanations of human behaviour. So you're basically evaluating that, so that's A03. So have a go at those. We'll go through the answers next lesson, and any questions, as always, email me, put it onto Teams. Please submit your notes onto Teams, and I will see you soon.